It's not fair. If you have children, you've heard that at some time in your life. And what did you say back to your children? Well, life's not fair. Just get used to it. But isn't it wonderful that children have this innate sense that life should be fair, that things should be right? Bruce Hornsby says that's just the way it is. Some things will never change. That's just the way it is. And then he adds, but don't you believe them. Things can be right. As we thought about the things that Paul encouraged us to think upon, rightness, justice is important. My father used to tell me, Nelson, it's never wrong to do the right thing. I thought he was so wise until I found out he was actually quoting Mark Twain. I'm not sure if he was right to quote somebody and not give them credit, but it stuck with me. It's never wrong to do right. Or as Albus Dumbledore says, dark times lie ahead of us, and there will come a time when we must choose between what is easy and what is right. The youth quoted it with me. We need to know that there are choices that we make. Will we do what is right? So how do we know what is right? Well, Scripture is pretty clear about some rights and some wrongs. When the children of Israel needed instruction, God gave to them the law, the 10 Commandments. He said, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall make no idols. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. In other words, God says, I am God and I must be God. Nothing else can ever come before me, and don't forget that. Always hold God up first and foremost. And then he said, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. God says if we just live our lives for ourselves and just go on and on and on and never stop, we will not honor God. Not only do we need rest, but we need a day when we put everything else aside and we say, this is the Lord's day. This is the day that we think about God and what God would have us to do with our lives. My mother got a phone call one day from a church member. My father, as you know, was a pastor, and the woman was very upset because she said my father had called her teenage son a pig. So when Dad came in, Mom said, did you call James a pig? He said, no, he was hanging outside church during Sunday school. And I said, James, go to Sunday school. And he said, I don't want to. And I said, well, pigs do what they want. God gave us a brain to know what's right and wrong. Make up your own mind. I didn't call him a pig. He just chose to be one. Remember the Sabbath day. We need a day to stop and think about what is right and wrong. And so God continues on and says to honor your father and your mother, to live lives worthy of them. And then just in case we forget it, God gave us some don'ts. You shall not commit murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet. These are some things that God says, just don't. Don't do them. If you want to know right and wrong, there are some things that you should not do. When Jesus sat down in what we call the Sermon on the Mount and began to teach, he also taught us some rights and wrongs. He taught us that there are things that if we think and do, they lead to bad consequences. Jesus knew that that which is in our heart and in our mind will come out in our actions. He basically says that hate leads to murder, but repentance leads to reconciliation. Jesus taught that lust will lead us to adultery, but true love will lead us into right relationship. Jesus taught us that lies will create mistrust, but truth and honesty will bring integrity. Jesus taught us that if we make enemies, we will be at war with them. But if we serve others, we will form community. Jesus taught us that if we sow seeds of injustice through greed, that we will have societies that fall apart. But if we are generous people, that generosity will sow unto righteousness, and a plentiful harvest will provide for all. Jesus taught us that selfishness will lead us to empty lives where we are never fulfilled. But if we seek God and God's kingdom first, we will have lives filled with purpose and meaning. Jesus taught us that it's so easy to deceive ourselves, but that God sees everything, and nothing is hidden from God. Jesus taught us that we must make choices in our lives, that we cannot be halfway. We must choose to do what is right, or we will do what is wrong. And Jesus says, if you do not remember this, just remember, if you want something done according to you, how would you like people to treat you? Then you do that for others. We call it the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Jesus also taught us a parable in Matthew 25 when he taught about the separation of the sheep and goats. And you know how he takes the sheep to one side and he says, I was hungry and you fed me. Jesus basically is saying, if someone is hungry and you have food, open up and share and give to them. Jesus says, if someone is thirsty, give them something to drink. If someone is a stranger or an outcast, welcome them in to your life. If someone is naked, clothe them. If someone is sick, take care of them. If someone is in prison, don't forget them and cut them off, but go and visit them. Jesus says, if you do these things to the least of these, you are doing it as unto me. You see, there's plenty that we know about right and wrong, what not to do and what to do. And Paul says we need to think about what is right so that we might do it. He also tells the Romans in Romans 12:2 that not to conform to the pattern of this world, but that we should be transformed by the renewing of our minds. That what we think on, what we dwell on, what we meditate about will come out in our lives. If you want to do what's right, think about what God would have you to do. And to do right, to do justly, there are some things that we must rid ourselves of. And the first is selfishness. When children say, it's just not fair, it's usually about something that's happened to them. Sometimes they're fighting over a toy, and early on we learn whether to be givers or takers, to be selfish, to be about us, or to share our toys. Society plays off of selfishness. Think about it. What are all the ads you see in the paper, in the internet, on TV? What do they tell you? You need something. Something's missing in your life. You need new shampoo so your hair looks good, or you need these new clothes, or you need to travel to this place. It's all about you. And if we're always thinking just about ourselves, we will never see those whom God is calling us to minister to. My cousin Ben, when he and his wife Angela were married, went to Jamaica on their honeymoon. When they got back, I said, Ben, I've never been to Jamaica. What was it like? Did you enjoy it? Was it a wonderful resort? And he said, Nelson, we landed and we were so excited and we looked at the brochures and we knew our resort was going to be wonderful, but I just couldn't enjoy the resort. And I said, why, Ben? He said, because from the time we landed till the time we got to the resort, we drove through utter poverty. And we got into this resort, and there was all the food you could eat. There were 5 restaurants to choose from, and everybody was smiling as if everything was all right. And all I could think about was just outside the gates of this resort, people are starving, and we're throwing this food away. And I thought, that is a picture of our world today. We who have so much. And we drive through poverty, even in our own community. And we have a world that is in need, and we have so much, and do we give, or do we just say, we need more? We need to examine our value systems. We need to see if we're just being selfish, and churches can be selfish too. My home church, the one I grew up in, when I was a teenager, built a gymnasium. We had a family life center. It was something that when we built it, we were so proud of it. And we put a big sign on it that said, "To the glory of God." A few months went by, and we had all these people that were supposed to volunteer and to be there to keep the doors open and closed. And people got a little bit tired of that and started not showing up. And so they just started giving out keys. Just whoever wants to come, come. But then they had a problem that the doors were being unlocked, and they had kids coming in off the street just to play basketball day and night. And so they changed the locks. And right under that sign that said, "To the glory of God," they put another sign that said, "For our members and their guests only." Something just didn't seem just about that sign to me. The church was saying, we've got this nice thing that we said was going to be for ministry, but is it just for us? My friends, you cannot look at the cross of Christ and be selfish. For Christ calls us to die to self and to live for him. We must also, if we want to live justly and rightly, remove pride from our living. Pride is thinking too highly of ourselves, thinking that we know it all. When Jesus was going to the cross, you remember Peter came in front of him and said, "No, you can't do that." And Jesus said, "Get behind me, Satan." When we think we know more than God, we are in danger. And arrogance can take over our lives and can take over a congregation. When we are just about ourselves, when we look at what we do and we say we're doing grand and wonderfully, we need to be careful, for there is so much more that God is calling us to do. When they tried to build a tower up to God, God knocked it down and put them in other languages and distributed them around the world. We call it the story of the Tower of Babel. We are here to build God's kingdom, not just our church. Pride says, "I know it. I don't need to know anything else about life." My friend Walter Cotter, who taught with me, came into Teacher's Lounge one day and said, "I just had an interesting experience." I said, "What was it, Walter?" He said, "Well, I started reviewing last week's lesson so that I might introduce this week's lesson. And as I was reviewing it, the kids started smarting off and saying, 'Well, Mr. Cotter, we already know this stuff. You're repeating what you just said last week.' I said, 'Well, what did you do?' He said, 'Well, I just said, clear your desk, take out a piece of paper and your pencil. Let's see if you really remember this stuff that you think you know.' I said, 'How'd they do on the pop test?' He said, 'Not very well.' They were filled with pride, and they thought they knew it. And we too think we know how things are supposed to be. And God calls us to humble ourselves. Jesus says that we are sinners. James says that we must confess our sins one to another. And if we were to confess our sins, John says, that he will be faithful and just to forgive us our unrighteousness. Church is a place about coming together and not talking about how grand we are, but that we are sinners in need of God's grace. And therefore we give that grace to one another. There's something else we must rid our lives of, and that is prejudice. You know what prejudice is. It means to prejudge, to see someone else and think you already know them, even though you've never met them. The early church struggled with prejudice. Those Jewish converts to the faith did not want to accept the Gentile converts. And the Gentile converts looked back at the Jewish converts and said, they don't get it either. And there was strife. There was preference for the rich in the early church. People were coming in and they were taking them up and giving them the best seats because they thought they could do something for the church. And then the church started turning and saying, them out there, those sinners, when we are all sinners. The modern church can be the same. When we don't want to reach certain groups of people, when God calls us to reach everyone, and we say something like this, well, we would try, but they just wouldn't be comfortable in our church. Well, why would that be? What would we need to do to make all people comfortable? Because Jesus said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release for the captives and recovery of sight for the blind, and to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And Jesus says, it's not about us. It's about our ministry. You see, God demands justice. I don't like to preach out of the prophets. I get uncomfortable when I read words like we read from Isaiah today, because the prophets speak truth to us, not just about the sins that we might point out. You know those sins. Someone once said, if you want to grow a big church, just preach against sin, as long as it's not the sins that your people are doing. Or as my sister used to say, I don't smoke, drink, or chew, and I don't go out with anyone that does. You know, we just pick out whatever those sins might be. But what about the social sins, like the cycles of poverty that continue on in our modern day world when there is plenty? What about folks getting rich off of the poor? What does it say about us when 1% of the households in America have more wealth than the 90% combined? What does that say to us? Isaiah says you can't hide behind religion. I don't like this in Isaiah chapter 1, where God basically is looking down at God's people, at what we would call the church, and saying, I hate your worship. I can't stand what you're doing. You're bringing offerings and you're acting pious, and yet you have blood on your hands. That is hard for us to hear. But God gives us a solution when Isaiah says to his people, as Isaiah would say to the church today, learn to do what is right. Seek justice. Defend oppressed. Take up the cause of the fatherless. Plead the case of the widow. Isaiah says to his people, look out for those who can't look out for themselves. Take what power you have and use it for good. For you see, power is not for us. If God gives us a blessing, if God empowers us, it's for us to use it for God's good. What makes a superhero a hero? I mean, is Superman a hero because he's the man of steel and he can fly? Is Spider-Man a hero because he has spidey senses and can climb up walls? Is Wonder Woman a hero because she's got that lasso of truth and she's got that invisible jet? Those may be their powers, their special things that set them apart. But what makes them heroes is that they don't use that power for themselves, but rather they use it for others. A hero is someone who has power and uses it on behalf of others. The church used to be the most powerful organization in the world. There was a time when pastors were revered, and you could take a poll and say, who are the most respected people in the world? And pastors would come up number 1. We come up around number 8 now in Gallup polls. We've fallen pretty far. Some might say, well, it's the failing of a few. There's been some bad apples, and there have been. Some may say, well, it's the marginalization of the church. The church just isn't respected in culture anymore. And I would ask, did we have power that we did not use for good? For if you use your power for good, God will bless that. But if you don't use your power for good, you will lose your power for good. God has blessed us as a church abundantly and has called us to ministry. You see, God's people must live justly. James says it this way: what good is it, my brothers and sisters, If you have faith, but you have not works, can you be saved by your faith? If a brother or sister is naked or lacks food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm, and eat your fill, and yet you do not supply their bodily needs, what good is that? So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. We are called to live justly. Survival is not the purpose of the church. Just to say our church is still here is not a very good purpose. The church lives by mission. It is not about us. And if we are internally focused, we will lose our ability to be the church. We must look out. We must live as just people, and we must speak for justice, because silence leads to tragedy. Martin Niemöller, Protestant pastor who lived in the days of Adolf Hitler, said this: first, they came for the socialists, but I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. And then they came for the trade unionists, but I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. And then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. We may not be facing a Hitler in our days, but we have plenty of social ills. There is justice and injustice around the world. We live in a violent world that's filled with shootings, with things that just aren't right. And we live in a culture that seems to just want to talk about the extremes. One side might want to talk about security and say, well, what we need is more guns. The other side might say, well, let's talk about the social ills and mental illness, and we need to get rid of all the guns. Could the church be a place where people come together? As God says, come, let us reason together. Let's think through this. Is the church a place where we might find common sense solutions and provide some middle ground? Is the church a place that might say, we need to love and care for our children and our students and their teachers, and we need to go into our schools and say, what do you need? Not just for protection, but what do you need to be the school that you should be? Do we need to be a place that looks after for those who are on the margins of our society, who might be at risk and who might cause harm? We do live in a hostile world, and Jesus says that we are to be people of peace, for he were the Prince of Peace. There is plenty of strife right here in our own community. Could we be a church that speaks out with a voice for justice? Could we open our eyes and see what is around us? Several years ago, a couple in my church, Gene and Gail, came up to me on Sunday and they said, Pastor, we won't be here Wednesday night. And I said, well, thanks for letting me know. Why aren't you going to be here? And they said, we've got to be in court. Well, that caught my attention because I thought, Gene and Gail in court? What in the world could be going on with them? They're good people. And I said, well, I hope it's not something serious. They said, oh, no, Pastor, we're not going to court because we're in trouble. We're going to court because we are guardian ad litems. I said, sounds like Greek to me. Well, it's Latin. I said, what is a guardian ad litem? He said, we have taken training and we have volunteered that when there is a court case and a child is involved, we go and we represent that child. We speak for the child. I thought, wow, what a wonderful thing to do. And then I thought about the church. Should we be guardian ad litems? Should we be those who look out at a world and speak for children and speak for those who are on the edge of society and speak words of truth and justice and speak up? For I think the church must be the guardian of the world. If we don't do it, who will?